So let's start by talking about Osama bin Laden, who plays the title role in your book, which is called The Killing of Osama bin Laden. You challenge virtually every detail of the story, both the official narrative and the media reports. Can you start by summarizing sort of briefly what you found in this piece?
Well, basically, the one reality is the president did authorize the execution, if you will, of Osama bin Laden, and the SEALs did carry it out. And that's a fact, and that's absolutely correct. And it was done in Abbottabad, which was a resort town about 50 or 60 miles uphill from Islamabad, the capital. And it's a place that in the summer, Islamabad, if you've been there in summers, it gets to 120. And so it's I call it the Martha's Vineyard of Islamabad, of Pakistan, where the rich and the generals and the senior bureaucrats go, and they have summer houses. It's sort of an upscale area. That all happened. After that, it's sort of what I describe as a Lewis Carroll story, because the White House said this was all done. He'd gone there. Last time we heard about bin Laden, we were looking for him in the mountains, the Tora Bora area, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush Mountains, sort of a wild man, no man's land. We were looking for him, we couldn't find him. This was late 01, 02. We went on to bomb and attack Iraq and moved away. We're still in this war, what, 15 years now, Bob? And how are we doing in that war? But no, that's another question. And so
We'll give it another 15 years.
Oh my God. Yes, there's no end. It seems no end because we're doing the same policy. My argument basically in the book, in the essays in the book, most of them were written for the London Review books, all of them were, and not that well known here, is argument that Osama bin, that the President of the United States, Barack followed the Cheney-Bush policy much too much more than we really want to know. Anyway, the story is that, the White House story is that, oh my God, we had wonderful couriers. We had people in the basement of the CIA who were tracking couriers. And bin Laden, once he left Tora Bora, why he was active, he was the energetic runner, and he was sending messages and directing traffic for Al-Qaeda, I guess worldwide. That's sort of the implication, never quite said that. And then the couriers, with amazing skill and with the use of torture, waterboarding, if anybody's seen the movie that was generated out of this, Zero Dark 30, I think it's called. I did see it. It begins with the torture, enhanced interrogation, waterboarding, and we got the evidence we wanted. We got bin Laden, and then we didn't tell the Pakistanis, and we went in by ourselves. Two choppers could evade the radar of Pakistan and went in and did the mission, killed the guy, and the guy, in the initial story, he had an AK-47 when they confronted him, bin Laden, and in order to protect themselves, the SEALs had to shoot him in a room on a compound there. And then we fled out, and we had a chopper that was blew up. It was an accident. It crash landed, and since the Blackhawks, the chopper in which the 22 squads, actually 4 squads of 6, this Navy SEALs, even though they haven't been on water in years, they still move in groups of 6, which that's how many fit into a dinghy. Sort of a nice touch, because the SEALs have gone crazy with the fact that they're not going into the water anymore, and many of them leave because that's just not what they were trained to do, not just run on the ground and kill people. But anyway, the SEALs went in and had to kill him, took the body out and flew back. Meanwhile, a rescue chopper came in, which was a twin-engine chopper. I've forgotten the name of it. It's carries 55 passengers. It travels about 110, maybe 130 miles an hour at most. And they took that out along with the Black Hawk because they didn't have enough room in the one Black Hawk, and they flew out that way without being detected by the radar. That's the story. And the American press went gung-ho for it. It was a great night when the president announced, "We've got him." That was the words. Basically, he was killed, and the war on terror is over, and the Americans marched in the streets, and I celebrated it too. Was very happy to see him dead, although I knew this guy had been out of business for 10 years. This isn't going to end the war, but in the next week or so, the American press, it's what happens when you get a story like this. The White House controlled the narrative. They're begging for briefings. Everybody wants an exclusive. And they're dealing out facts. They had to recant after a little while that he didn't have an AK-47. Then they went to, he had 2 women with weapons protecting him. And then they had to back off that. And there was a firefight, huge firefight, and a lot of people were shot up and killed. They haven't really backed off that, but that sort of diminished. And if you remember, his wives and children were taken away, and we're gonna interrogate them. That never happened. They were flown out by the Pakistani intelligence service a month or so later back to Saudi Arabia. All these stories sort of disintegrated over the next couple of weeks, but nobody paid attention. We were still, the press was still, tell us more. And I remember my favorite story was the one about, one of the SEALs had brought a dog in on the mission, and they described how the president met the dog, and one of the stories was that when the chopper crashed, they had to blow it up, and big explosion, and if people came, neighbors came in this very sort of elegant area of Pakistan, a resort area, if people came to wonder what's going on, the dog was put outside to tell them, to stay away. And I remember thinking, oh my God, we've got a dog that barks in Urdu, which is the local nature, an Urdu barking dog. So there was no story that wouldn't go. The fire department in this area, which is very skilled, the police department, which is very skilled, did not show up at all, even though the time of the mission, which was supposed to be 20 minutes, ended up being 40 because the SEALs had to fly in a rescue chopper that was also parked in Pakistan, without the Pakistani knowledge. And so, it's such a bad story. Let me just tell you a few things. And one of my complaints chronically, when I speak to journalism schools, and I speak actually more in Europe on investigative journalism than here these days, but still, the annual meetings of the IRE, Investigative Reporting Group, I speak to a lot of schools. The first thing I always say is, you have to read before you write. You've got to read. And so one of the things you needed to do is take a look at the radar system that Pakistan had. And I'll just take a second to tell you how it began. We know that bin Laden worked for us in the early 80s when we decided, Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski decided we were going to drive the Russians, we were going to have a proxy war with the Russians in Afghanistan. And Schadenfreude, the Russians were stuck as we thought we had been in Vietnam, and we were going to go and we used bin Laden and other fundamentalists to help fight a war and win the war. And we also we began paying a lot of money to the Pakistani intelligence service, which is known as the ISI, and now it's become one of the great tough services of all time. The Pakistani ISI is like the Egyptian military. They have great investments. They own things. They buy property in Australia. They're building a huge housing and business complex in Islamabad. They're big. They're tough. They're very skilled. We all know that. We brought them in to help us fight the Taliban and the other groups inside Afghanistan, help us win the war against the Russians. And what happened then is the Pakistan's very wisely, the one thing that happened is when the ISI got in, to go back, as you know, there's a long enmity between India and Pakistan, 2 royal colonies of the Brits that split up. And when the Russians began to move into Pakistan, the Indians moved in. They set up, not only they had an embassy, but they set up consulates. When the ISI began to fight on our side, one of the things they did, and what I'm telling you now was reported in press, you can find it in news clips, they invaded some of the consulates and began killing Pakistani diplomats and even hanging some. That kind of entity exists. Well then, by 85 or so, when they were active in all the anti-Indian and all the stuff for us inside Afghanistan, helping us beat the Russians and drive them out, at that point, the Indians had nuclear weapons and could deliver them. Pakistan had a reactor going, a place called Kahuta, enriching uranium, but they weren't able to weaponize yet. So what did they do? They said, help us. And so what did we do? We put up money over 8 or 10 years to build a very sophisticated 3D audible, which means you can't erase a signal, a system. I think Raytheon was the main contractor. When I looked at it, it was over $900 million bucks. We built a great radar system for them. And between Islamabad and Delhi, there's one or two flights a week now, and it's about an hour flight, 350 miles or so. And so, my God, all you had to do is look up the kind of radar system they had, and you knew this story that they the story, the basic story that our two Black Hawk helicopters could evade radar was ludicrous, just ludicrous. So you start from there. And I began looking at all the different facts.
So what you said in your article and in what you said in the book, let me just sort of suggest some things, is that it wasn't brilliant intelligence that discovered where bin Laden was, but it was a walk-in, it was a tip from a Pakistani officer, that we took that to the Pakistanis and said, now we know where he is, so either you cooperate or else. They did. They cleared the decks for the whole U.S. operation. We moved into Pakistan knowing that they were basically standing down in and around the compound and in the skies of Pakistan. There was no firefight, as the administration said. It was really just one old guy who was not just shot once or twice, but, as you say, obliterated by the fire. They even allowed us to set up, you report, a command center in a nearby Pakistani facility to guide the whole operation. So this was really a complete myth, essentially, that was created by the administration in order to protect Pakistan, I guess, from the consequences, among other things. Is that about right, or is
that a perfect summary? The man that walked in, I can be less coy about him now because the Pakistanis obviously know who he is. He was a Pakistani colonel, and not in the ISI, but in military intelligence, army intelligence, who was disaffected. And there was $25 million on the table. We offered that much money for information about Pakistan. He did come in 2010. And to show you how sort of naive I am, I made a point of, early in the piece, of writing that he went directly to our station chief, a very competent guy named Jonathan Bank, and what I did in the article is I wrote that Bank was there because Bank had been mentioned earlier, particularly in the Urdu press, because there had been a flap involving the CIA, and we had to move him out of the country early, and it was so his name was mentioned. You know, it's against the law to write the name of a covert operator. It's a theoretical. They haven't really tried to push that law, but it is a law. But he'd been mentioned, so I mentioned him by name for the simple reason that I thought the way you could really go after me in this story. There was a long story. It's 10,000 words. And it was checked very carefully by the London, just as carefully as when I worked for stuff for the New Yorker. In fact, the London Review hired some of my better New Yorker checkers who did the checking, and took weeks of this stuff. You know, it cost a lot of money to do this right, which the New Yorker is famous for doing. In any case, I thought by leaving his name in there, I knew I was going to jeopardize him because there are many people in the government immediately think because he's named he was the source, but he wasn't. In any case, I thought, the way I could really be hurt on this story, I knew there'd be attacks by the White House, is if they somehow could convince John Bank, who I knew had a reputation for being honest, to go public 3 or 4 days after my story, which attracted enormous attention, as we all knew it would, and go public and say, walk-in? Hersh, I don't know what he's talking about. He said nothing. And I thought the press would appreciate the dog that didn't bark is really important, but they didn't. They were too busy chasing the White House briefings to really pay attention to the fact that who wasn't talking about it, the one guy that was directly involved.
Well,
and so let me
you certainly had, yeah, go ahead.
Well, the other point is that, of course, the underlying point here, the critical point is when all of this was being planned, when we confronted the Pakistanis, we were enraged at them, and of course their answer to, the whole point was they were going to look the other way, we were going to go take them out, we had to take the body out, and we were not going to talk about it, not for a week or 10 days. And it was all agreed. The president then would announce we had a drone raid. We do it all the time in the Hindu Kush Mountains on the Pakistani, not on the Afghan side, making clear it was on the Afghan side. And we hit a house, a wooden house with a Hellfire missile, and we did an after-action look, and we found the long, tall guy there. Bin Laden 6'4" or something like that. And we did DNA, and my God, we got him. And that would have been just as good. But that night, and I remember this vividly because it was a Sunday night here in Washington, and by 7:30 or 8, there were reports all over the media that the president has a special announcement to make. And by 10 o'clock, there were stories that might have to do with bin Laden, but he didn't go public till almost 3 hours after the first word. And what was going on was a fight, because there was pressure on him, political pressure from his political advisors, not to wait the 7 or 10 days. They were very angry at Robert Gates, the Republican Secretary of Defense, whom Gates had, if you remember, Gates had been reappointed or allowed to stay by, he'd been appointed, he replaced Rumsfeld by George Bush, and he was very close to the Bush family, Gates was. And when Obama came in, he reappointed him. But 2.5 years later, there was tension inside, a Republican doing things, and Gates was very much against some of the things that happened in the operation. He thought we just should bomb the place and let it go and not jeopardize the SEALs, because if something had gone wrong and they'd been captured, they would be accused of, they had no protection. They were basically committing a war crime. He was a prisoner of war, is what the point. And they executed a prisoner of war. And they went into a country without any notice to the authorities. That's theoretically what happened. So anyway, here's what the issue was for Gates, basically, and for me as a journalist. What's so important about Pakistan? Why do we spend so much time cozying it up to the generals who run it? It's because they control more. Right now, when I wrote about it in the New Yorker in 2009, it was more than 100 nuclear weapons. And we worry about their weapons. We worry about their safety. There's a huge Muslim fundamentalist population in Pakistan. And in fact, the reason that the Pakistanis had never said anything publicly about having him since '06 is when the walk-in told us he came in. ISI found him in '06, according to the walk-in, which may or may not be correct. It could be earlier. I think it might be. But in any case, that's what the walk-in told us. The Pakistanis kept him secretly because the public would go nuts. The public loved bin Laden. Many elements of the public, 50%, 40% of the country, saw him as a hero. And so as long as they had bin Laden, they could privately tell the Al-Qaeda groups and the Taliban groups in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, we got your guy. Pay more attention to us. Keep us informed. They had more control. That was their argument. The second argument they made, explanation for keeping him, is the Saudis paid him a lot of money. The Saudi Arabian government, you know, he's a Saudi. He came from an elegant, very wealthy family, bin Laden family in Saudi Arabia, big construction family, not royal family, but they were major constructionists in building, and very wealthy. And the assumption we make, and I make, is that nobody wanted an American interrogation team to talk to him. So the whole deal, once the Pakistani leadership, a general named Pasha who ran the ISA and a general named Kiani, and my God, what we did for them. You want a new armored car? Yeah. You want a helicopter? Yeah. Kiani loved golf. You want to go play golf with Jack Nicklaus in Ohio? Why? We'll fix it up. We did that stuff for them because we wanted them to trust us enough to let us know where the bombs were. And it was a cat and mouse game going on. Of course, we didn't tell them what we planned, and they didn't tell us everything, too. The word in the intelligence community, our fear was that some of the bombs that they were telling us about, you know, where they were in igloos or under the ground, some of the bombs actually were hidden in the tall grass along the runway, out of the count. They always kept a few. That was just natural suspicion. So this is what's on the table. So that night, when the president decides to violate the agreement, he's really jeopardizing a relationship that I will tell you until today has not been fully resolved. There's still bitterness among the Pakistani leadership about being hung out to dry.
Well, if they were holding captive, and public enemy number one, and not only holding him captive but protecting him and using him to their advantage, they obviously have a lot to answer for. Your story in the book and in the London Review has been disparaged by a lot of people, but there were also people like Carlotta Gall and some other folks, Steve Call, NBC, that confirmed details of what you reported. Are you surprised, though, Cy, that there's been so little follow-up? In other words, that so few journalists, since this piece first came out, have picked up one or another piece of it and tried to confirm or disprove what you wrote? Are you are you concerned or surprised by that?
When I was at the New York Times for 7, 8, 9 years, I was their sort of hotshot lead investigative reporter. I won a lot of prizes, you know, writing about Watergate, writing about Vietnam and the CIA in Chile and all that stuff. Kissinger's wiretapping and the domestic spying by the CIA that led to the church hearings. A lot of wonderful stories. And if somebody at the Times had said, there's a great story that was published by the LA Times, we want you to follow it, I would have said, Me? I don't follow other people's stories. I do my own. It's a very bitchy business. So for the really good reporters, the good investigative reporters on the Times and the Post, etc., they don't want to follow someone else's story. It's just a reality. And here's the thing that really got me was within a week of the story, there was an interview show with, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but there was a senior reporter for the foreign policy reporter for the Washington Post, one of those reporters who doesn't like following other stories. And this reporter was asked about my story. And the reporter said, well, actually, she said, we all sort of knew right away. This is within 5 or 6 days of publication of my story. We all knew that the Pakistani military and intelligence services had to know where he was. It didn't make sense that they did not. That part of the story doesn't work. But yes, so what was being said essentially was, we had that. That's how you get rid of a story. I used to work for the AP covering the Pentagon in the 60s, on-the-job training and learning how to hate the Vietnam War. And as a reporter for the AP, if anybody broke a good story, they would call me and wake me up at 11:30 at night sometimes, the New York desk or the overseas desk. Can you match it? And the first thing I would do was call the press secretary for Robert McNamara, who I concluded was a psychotic liar. After dealing with him, I really did. I thought he just was lying about everything. And didn't even know how much he was lying. As he later sort of talked about, later a wonderful movie by a great movie maker. Anyway, I would call up and say, can I have your denial? So then I'd file a story and say, the Pentagon denied today. I'm telling you, it was that petty. That's how bitchy we are in the business. But I was, it's funny, you cross the water. This book came out in London, too, at the same time as it did here. And I went for a few days to London and did a couple of big events, in one case with a senior editor of a major newspaper there. And there were a lot of people there. And we were talking about the Bin Laden story, and I turned tables on him after a few minutes. I asked him, I said, you guys, though, you're closer. As I said, it's a royal colony. You guys go to India and Pakistan. You have much more ties. You're much more sophisticated about that part of the world than we are. We have all that water between us. And he said, yes. And I said, so what did you guys think? He said, I'm not exaggerating. He said, well, we had meetings and we concluded right away it was impossible for the Pakistani ISI, because you know how competent they are, not to know that where he was there. Because, among other things, Abbottabad happens to be in the center, literally the center, of not only that secret base you mentioned about, you mentioned earlier, a secret base in which we worked with the Pakistani intelligence service and our CIA on covert ops, also a base at which the Pakistanis train the guards for the nuclear arsenal. 2 reactors. Pakistan now has a plutonium reactor, also in a ring about it, a major air base. If you draw a circle, in the middle is Abbottabad. He wasn't there by accident. They parked him in a place where they had total coverage. And also, they made it clear, it was clear in the earlier reporting, and you have to go back to the first things that were said. He had no internet. He had no electronic communication. He was completely isolated. In fact, our guys, when we landed, we were walked into his prison by an ISI official. And if you remember, even in the stories they told, we had to blow 2 steel doors. If there were 2 steel doors, he was a prisoner, clearly. A prisoner of war, a prisoner of what you want. Not a prisoner of love. But anyway, the more I got
so now,
go ahead.
There's been a lot of criticism, too, right, of the story, not just lack of follow-up, but I picked out a few quotes. I'm sure you heard them. Mark Bowden said,
yes.
It's faked moon landing territory, your story. And Peter Berger called it a farrago of nonsense. The Salon and Politico and Vox weighed in. The Washington Post talked about it being, quote, even kind of crazy, said Paul Fahey, their media guy. So what's this all about? Why was there so much, not just failure to follow up, but this kind of nastiness of, accusing you of being a conspiracy monger?
Well, there are a couple of things about.
What's that about?
Well, I mean, I've had this most of my career with most of my stories. There's been an enormous amount of criticism. When I did the My Lai story, not so much Abu Ghraib, we had a document there, but I did the Abu Ghraib story.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stories, if you look at the original story I wrote about the domestic CIA spying in the New York Times. It was late December 1974. My God, the Washington Post for 3 months was attacking me and saying that wasn't right. I was, that there weren't files, the CIA wasn't keeping files on Americans, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that stuff eventually, people, that's, you tell me, I don't want to describe what it's about. I mean, it's pretty obvious in some cases what it is because, I've been doing this a long time and writing stories that often people, that should have been written by others much earlier. So part of it is that in the case of Mark Bowden, I like Mark Bowden. He wrote Black Hawk Down. He were good friends. And
you quote him in your book a couple of times.
Well, I quote him because first you have to know something. In the CIA, when you have a walk-in, that's manna. You protect the walk-in. And so here you have, in the basement of the Intelligence Bureau, there you have a bunch of people working on tracking couriers. You want to figure out where the couriers are. And if you pay attention to the Senate Intelligence Committee, which last year, if you remember, I think early last year, they published a major report on terror and torture. If you remember that report, it was a 6,000-page report, only 500 pages of which were cleared. But 500 pages were published. And if you read those, as I did, there was a section on couriers. And it's described how the CIA was trying to track couriers and got nowhere. Couldn't do it, just couldn't make any sense of the couriers. The names that we have so many problems with an E and an A in the name, how they're spelled differently in the West, some of the Muslim names. And it's literally said impossible to track. But that's okay. According to the CIA, to the debriefs, not so much in the initial statements, so a day or two later, senior intelligence officials, even the head of the CIA, Mr. Brennan, he was then, I guess, in the White House as the deputy for counterterrorism. John Brennan, later went to the CIA, gave briefings in which they talked about how we tracked them by couriers and all got into this torture business. Gates had fought bitterly against this, saying, don't start lying about torture because the CIA is worried about the fact there may be congressional hearings and there may be legal findings about what we did. The CIA was killing people in torture. That happened much more than anybody knows. There was a lot of murder going on. It wasn't murder. They tortured people and they bled to death, whatever. And in some cases, there were murders and no prosecutions, of course. In Abu Ghraib, there was a couple of cases where nobody got punished for anything. And so you had that issue. You were trying to justify using the couriers. And the problem was that in order for him to be using couriers, you had to contradict the earlier stories about this guy who was isolated. At one point, they talked about him sitting around watching video porno. He was briefed. They showed a picture of this old man hunched over watching pornography. It was said you could say anything you wanted in the first few days. Everything was taken. So that element, the couriers and the people doing the courier tracking were told, "My God, you helped us. You helped us find him. Yes, it was your work. Why not? Because you want them to think so. Because then reporters could talk to them, and the people giving them the briefings would be convinced they had." You don't tell them about a walk-in. You tell nobody about a walk-in. That's a sacrosanct secret, not even inside the agency. So that's one element. The other element is Bowden had written a piece, one of what they call a TikTok piece, 5 months later. He saw everybody, the president and all those people, Brennan and everybody involved. Oh, my God, what a wonderful operation. He wrote a piece about the operation for Vanity Fair, a long piece. And in it, he included an account of the photographs of bin Laden being buried at sea off a carrier. And he described it vividly. And so I knew Mark, and I liked Mark. I didn't want to embarrass him. I waited till a week before the piece was published. First of all, I knew a lot. I knew that where the bin Laden was taken to was a base in Pakistan called Jalalabad. It's a forward base close to the Hindu Kush Mountains. At that time, there were no fixed-wing airplanes there. They only used choppers. The aircraft carrier they went to was something like 800 miles away in the Indian Sea. How do you get him there was a problem. Secondly, I knew from ways I don't want to talk about because I don't want to get some Navy officers embarrassed, but I knew that everything is reported on a Navy ship. And that night, the Navy, that aircraft carrier never turned around to recover anybody, never told higher command we're picking up a chopper now or an airplane. That's very important. They have to do that. There was no such report in the logs. And the logs have since been classified. The third thing is I didn't know there were imams aboard an aircraft carrier ready to do an official Muslim married. So I knew that there was impossible that happened. So I called Mark up. He's teaching at the University of Delaware. And I said to Mark, I'm going to ask you a question to which I think the answer before I ask you is no. And here's the question. Did you actually see those photographs you described so vividly in your article? He described how they went in and how they looked. Long pause, and he said no. I said, well, how did you learn about them? Well, I was given a briefing about them, and from somebody I trust, and he described them very vividly. I said, well, why didn't you say you didn't, why didn't you say you hadn't seen them? He said, well, there was something to the effect, something to the effect that he wished he had, or the editors didn't want it. It was more vivid if I left that out. And I'm telling you, that's what happened. And so I can understand. Look, he didn't see him. It didn't happen. I'm sorry. It just didn't happen. They didn't know what to do. The body was a mess. Let me tell you why the body was a mess. Because the SEALs were only supposed to fire a few shots. There were 6, as I say, they come in groups of 6, in a dinghy. One guy guarded the door, and by the way, when they use plastique to blow up the steel-covered doors, they had learned from the ISI in advance exactly the dimensions and the thickness of the steel, because plastique, 6C4, if you use too much of it, it'll kill you. So it had just the right mounts. And one of the questions is, how did they know just enough to knock the door down with anybody getting hurt? Anyway, all because the Pakistanis were giving us that kind of intelligence. There was a lot of back and forth once they decided to play ball with us, the 2 leaders. And so what they did is they fired a lot of bullets into him, dumb bullets. And you don't have to do many. But each of the guys took some shots. And there wasn't much left of the body. We're never going to see photographs of the body. They produced one sort of tortured, I don't know how they did it, picture of him with 2 holes in it. But I got to tell you, there were a lot of holes in the guy's head. You could, I don't have to tell you how easy it is to make a photograph. Depict anything you want. Anybody saw that wonderful movie, what was it called? The Fog of War, a movie. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Some movie that described how we faked a war done back in the Clinton years. Anyway, so what happened is...
You mean wag the dog?
Wag the dog. Remember how let her have a dog, and there's a brook running, and remember, let's change the color of this. You can do that. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I don't know why people don't pay more attention to that stuff, but the body was a mess.
Back and I looked at...
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I found a quote from Hillary Clinton when she just became Secretary of State on her first visit to Pakistan. This was in first part of 2009. And she said, this is a quote from her from on that trip, and she said this in Pakistan: "I find it hard to believe that nobody in your government knows where Osama bin Laden is." Now, she would not have said that, I don't think, in 2009 in Pakistan if she didn't have some assurance from the intelligence community that, in fact, the Pakistanis did know in 2009 exactly where he was. So there she is on record saying, we heard this. Then after the raid in 2011, just 2 years later, she said, quote, "There's absolutely no evidence that anyone at the highest levels of the Pakistani government knew." So in other words, she went back on what she said after the raid. And I don't want to introduce politics into this discussion, but what does that say about Secretary Clinton? And do you think this is something she should be asked if she's running for president?
Oh, well, it's not going to be asked because it involves too much, it's complicated, and politics as played out.
Well, it's a simple question, right? She said this once, and then 2 years later she said that.
Well, then you'd have somebody who maybe buys into questions about what happened. And that's an uncomfortable thought that the president, I'll tell you something more. In his initial statement that night, the president, when he decided, when the political people won out, he made a public statement in which he made a lot of assertions. I write a lot about it. I don't know whether he knew everything he was saying was untrue, or most of it was, because, the president sometimes, they get a speech and they read a speech. I don't know what the mens rea. Did he know how much? He described bin Laden as having been confronted with weapons, and we got a treasure trove, I remember that, of documents. Here you are, you're on the run. SEALs, one of my favorite stories, that they keep on talking about all the books. Sometimes they say the SEALs took out the books with them that night, as if they hadn't time to carry out bags of books, or as if the SEALs, or most of them are enlisted guys. Some of them are, I'm sure, very bright, but I can't imagine that the SEALs, after having a chopper crash, being in a panic, sitting there looking at the bookcase saying, which one should I take first? Which one do I want to read first? It's comical, some of the stuff they did. So you have to buy into that story. But that night, the president also said, I want to thank the Pakistani counterintelligence forces for their help and they had to get rid of that. Within days, they were explicitly saying the president misspoke, and then the next week he went on television, and by this time, within a week, I knew the day after the raid that there was trouble, that Gates had made some real problems for them. I did know that. I did know that from somebody high up in the White House, that Gates was considered to be an enemy. He was against this. And then, what people don't want to know about me, I guess, is in '09 I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about the Pakistani bomb and our fear about it. And I spent weeks in Pakistan. I'd been there 3 or 4 times before that. And I spent weeks that I really got into some interesting stuff, to the point where, and here's what happens in the government. You do a story and you come in with some issues that, this is Obama administration, some issues that are uncomfortable, and the White House denies everything. That's just what they do. But so they denied I said there was, whatever I said that our goal basically was to make sure Pakistan could not fire a bomb without our approval. And if they ever tried to, we wanted to be in a position to knock out the whole system. The whole system, so they couldn't fire. Electronically, actually attack the igloos, knock out the command system. It's a pretty tough thing to say. And so, after denying all this, the White House called up my editor, Dave Remnick, David called me to say that he gotten a call from somebody high in the government, and this is the night before the story closed. It must have been a Thursday night. The magazine goes to print Friday night at midnight, somewhere in Tennessee. And he said that they're very concerned, and they said that if the story goes, one of the things we did at the New Yorker and we do at the London Review is we do share what we're writing with the people, give them a chance to talk, even though it's usually hopeless. And David said that that the American government, somebody senior in the government that he respected, I guess, and knew, maybe just because of the position, had told him that if the story is published as it was, we would have to close our embassy immediately and our consulates. We have a bunch of consulates, a big country, and move the people out for fear of riots, because the fundamentalists who really loved the bomb would attack us for alleging we had. So we toned down the story quite a bit. So I have contacts. I say that to mention that I have contacts in Pakistan. And within it, I heard the day after that there was problems in River City, inside the White House, with Bob Gates. He was seen as somebody who wasn't on the team on this. And I heard then from somebody close to the intelligence service in Pakistan, a 3-page email that described pretty much what I ended up writing. I went to Americans. I had to wait a day or so. I waited till the middle of the week, and I went to some Americans who would have known everything about it. I'm sorry, I have contacts. You know, Bob, as a journalist, we all have to depend on briefings, you know, and we have to depend on access. If you're covering the White House, you've got to maintain good relationships, and you can't go off the wagon too much. You could be aggressive, but not too far. And the manna, the thing you want, is somebody who, in the government, and there are many people like that, there are a lot of wonderful people in our government, whose loyalty, and when they sign the oath of office, is to the Constitution and not to the president. And when you have somebody like that on the inside, who is appalled by the lying and the misdirection, and also leaving the 2 senior generals who control the bomb with a reason to hate us. We left them with 2 options, Pasha and Kiana. One option was to tell everything to the people, that we knew he was there, and have their children not be able to walk to school because of fear of being counterattacked by the fundamentalists, who are very vigorous there. The other option is do what they did. We screwed up and we didn't know. Our radar system didn't work. Here's a radar system that we paid, and you could find it, $900 million for. All you had to do was some work. If you're a reporter the next week, instead of calling up and begging the White House for another briefing, go take a look at what's online. the contracts that are let. You can find stuff. Even the most secret, top secret contracts have to be announced. They may be announced top secret contracts to so-and-so for this. No more detail, but you can find that. They have to be announced somewhere in the government. And so nobody did that. All you had to do is go do the research, and you would see the stories about the radar not working. And we left them in this horrible position of having to say to their nation that their national defenses, including the protection against a nuclear attack, first strike from the hated Indians, is capable of being so easily defeated. And that was a terrible position to leave him. And Gates's position was all along, his underlying position, so I believe, is that you're messing with the two guys that control the bomb. You're undercutting our faith and confidence, their faith and confidence in us. And that's, to me, the reason why the real power behind what I'm writing is, and the real issue is that we have jeopardized the relationship with, what we used to be so frightened of, what we call the Islamic bomb. It's there. And we're not on good terms with the Pakistanis. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I wanted to shift gears a little bit in the time we have left, because a large part of your book, obviously several chapters have talk about Syria. And Syria is a five-sided Rubik's Cube with very difficult to see, through the Hall of Mirrors there. The United States is supporting some rebels and not other rebels, and we're supporting Iraq, but Iraq supports the Syrian government, and Iran supports the Iraqi and Syrian governments, and there's, it's a mess, right? And you talk a lot about Syria and the gas attack and a number of other things, but one of the points that really struck me is the chapter you call military to military. And you talk about how the military essentially, on its own initiative, the Joint Chiefs undertook to sabotage or undercut presidential policy in Syria because they didn't agree with it. You say on page 101, we did this without going through political channels. On page 102, Obama didn't know. The next page you say it was not some sinister Joint Chiefs plot to go around Obama to support Assad. But a few pages later you say that Assad understood this message that we can stop presidential policy, says the military. You say it doesn't sound like military independent thinking and action, but it does sound exactly like that. And regardless of what you think about Obama's Syria policy, and as a reporter, I've done my own reporting on that, isn't it kind of scary that the military, as you report, undertook to provide intelligence indirectly to Assad, while U.S. official policy was to support the overthrow of Assad?
I think this happened because, you're asking a complicated question. You've done a close read on it, and you're right.
Well, it isn't complicated because you say directly that the military did something independently without informing the White House to essentially support. I don't want to call Assad an enemy, but somebody who we didn't like and we're trying to get rid of.
The issue was, for the military, was very complicated because there was a tremendous amount of disagreement with the military, the American policy. If you remember, one of the articles I also wrote was called "The Red Line and the Rat Line." It was about the shipping of weapons into Turkey through Erdogan's Turkey. Erdogan, we now know, is of course it's pretty well known. He's become quite sort of crazy. He's now just in the last day or so, the UN is raising questions about the murder of PKK, the opposition Kurds that are going on daily. And he's also supported the ISIS very much, and al-Nusra. There's no question we have intelligence on that. And I mean, it had for years. And it was very hard to get the White House to switch, from the military's point of view, the arms going in, whatever moderates existed in 2012, by early 2013 had pretty much been overtaken by the crazies, by the more fundamentalist Salafists and Wahhabis, the groups supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar most notably. And so meanwhile, we're still shipping arms to the alleged moderates who had lost a lot of leverage inside. And many of them, by the way, at the last count, 61 various different tribal groups have made an accommodation with Assad in the last 6 or so months. He's been making accommodations with groups that have become disaffected, that maybe were rebels, but they were disaffected because the control of the opposition was in the hands of people who, if they'd taken over the country, would have caused enormous trouble. Israel would have been concerned about an ISIS government, because they would have been the next target. The Iranians certainly would have been moved. So there was, and it was very difficult for them to get a reading in the White House. The White House was stuck on a policy, and the president was isolated. And my understanding was that on a lot of issues, memos from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, who's now retired, would just disappear into a void. And this is something you hear quite a bit, that a lot of bureaucratic stuff doesn't get to the president. He's rather isolated and removed. And so, yes, they did decide that it was very important for Bashar to maintain leverage. This doesn't mean that in some future time, if an election process goes on, he would be out of office. But at this time, he was getting shaky in 2013, and we also were very concerned. I will tell you that by the fact, and it is a fact, I have documents. It doesn't matter, I even mentioned the documents in one story, very secret stuff I had. That by early spring of 2013, we knew that Saudi Arabia and the Turks were passing chemicals into al-Nusra and what became ISIS, the more radical groups, that when melded together created a form of very powerful nerve agent. Very difficult to work with, but we knew they had that capability. There were huge studies done about it in June, July, and May, June, and July. Even in one study about maybe how many troops would it take to wipe out all of the chemical weapons that were in the opposition's hand. It was 60,000 troops. It couldn't, just too many American troops. We thought about doing it. This is before the August event in which we claimed Bashar murdered his own people with nerve gas. And so the issue was, we had the kind of intelligence that he needed. We have satellite intelligence, we have intercepts, and the Germans were there helping him. And so we passed it. The Germans asked for help, and once they asked for help, we give allies a lot of help. I'm giving you the rationale. I'm not disputing your assessment of what the import was and what was understood. And I'll tell you something about Dempsey. We always think about generals as sort of neuters. Dempsey majored in English at the academy, military academy, and the Army, which does this often, recognizing he was quite skilled, I guess, as a student. They allowed him to spend 2 years getting a master's degree in fine arts at Duke. He's renowned among his friends and peers for his reading knowledge and for his love of Yeats and his knowledge about Yeats. He's sort of a passionate a devotee. And the day he retired August 31st of last year, and September the 1st, instead of joining the 14 boards of defense corporations, many are, as our former chairman do, and make $500,000 a year and that or more, he went back and he was given an appointment at Duke, and he's teaching there. He's a different cat. And so he made the call, I guess, with the help of others inside the Joint Chiefs and outside the government perhaps, to start helping, supplying Bashar Assad, the president I'm getting lost here, of Syria, with intelligence that would help him turn the corners on the war, and he did. And the other big thing that happened in the war that in the last year was, of course, the Russian.
And that doesn't seem like treason to you, to deliberately undercut the president's policy. I mean, you can quit if you're a general, and then you can speak out. But really, you kind of pretty much have to salute and say, yes, sir, if you're in the Joint Chiefs, don't you?
I find it pretty refreshing that we had a chairman of the Joint Chiefs who tried to express a view. And in that same article, in the next paragraph, I quote the former, by name, the head of the former, and I mentioned Dempsey by name too in the article, the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I quote him by name. Who was,
you're talking about Michael T. Flynn.
Michael Flynn. Who's
yeah, I was going to ask you about Flynn, because
yes.
you cite him as a source, one of the few people on the record, that you talk about. and you portray him as kind of a truth teller and somebody who resisted Obama. He was fired as head of DIA a couple years ago. But here's the thing about Flynn. I mean, he's recently emerged as an advisor, one of the top advisors to Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
He's written a book. He's written a book with Michael Ledeen, who is one of the
they're writing the book now. They're writing the book now.
Well, no, it's published. It comes out pretty soon. Yeah, its title is Field of Fight: How We Can Win the Global War Against Radical Islam and Its Allies. So, I mean, Flynn has clearly put himself in the camp of an extremist on fighting Islam in the global war against terrorism. I don't know why he was fired from DIA, but from the sound of it, he was fired because he was insubordinate. He was a radical who wanted to go after these guys, and he accuses the president of not wanting to fight hard enough against Islamism and all that, just the way, you know, the ultra-conservatives do.
He was very mouthy.
So, I mean, it's strange to me that you quote him as a truth teller, you know?
Because one of the issues was about him, you know, as you know, he also worked as the head of intelligence for this Joint Special Operations Command for years. He was a 2- and 3-star working.
Yeah, and he worked with McChrystal in Iraq, you know, during the most brutal of the time in Iraq, when they were just assassinating people by the hundreds during the counterinsurgency effort there in Anbar and so on, right?
Absolutely. There was a lot of stuff going on that was considered to be wonderful, and if you notice, McChrystal really got always great press, and he was promoted by Obama after years in Iraq of being very bloody to be head of the war in Afghanistan. And so on all of that, Flynn was always there. He was very active with the press corps. A lot of people had his email, which is how I got it. And the issue for me there was, you of course described somebody who was very conservative and got pushed out. But the fact of the matter is, what he said was very consistent with everything I knew. And he was willing to say it on the record. And what it was is that there was a whole series of reports that summer about al-Nusra and ISIS as it emerged very early, about how dangerous they were and how they had access to chemical weapons too. And so on that basis, I will tell you that Obama, he was shoved out, and they wanted him shoved out earlier. But you know, when you get a source on the record and he's saying something that you know from documents you have that is also so, and if you make it a point to make sure he was somebody who was held, you know, he was considered, I wouldn't say a wild man, but if you go back and look, he's been quoted by so many journalists along the way, all the way, and so he wasn't necessarily, in this case, somebody on the record who was saying something that suited my. What I learned is that he was. That he and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, their staffs, were simpatico on this issue. There are many issues they were not simpatico on. You know, he was certainly. His real problem was he created also dissent internally. He was reorganizing things. Pardon me, I have a slight cold. He was reorganizing things on the inside. But I don't think. I think, in all fairness to the guy, I think he was calling it as he saw it. Yes. In that case, he was absolutely right. And I had documents that demonstrated. They actually came from his office and went to his office. Some of the stuff, all sorts of stuff, CIA, NSA, Israeli intelligence. Some of the reports that were going on about the amount of nerve agent potential in the opposition before what happened in August, before the incident with in the suburb of Damascus, when 1,400 people were killed. Not that many, but that somebody were alleged to be killed. So, you know, it's a tough go. Somebody on the record, and what he's saying is consistent with, believe me, I'm checking what he says, consistent with other people involved. In terms of that narrow issue, his personal political views were way off the chart. But on the issue of what he was seeing and what they were saying, he was very consistent. And so the argument against him is he was mouthy. And he was a very conservative guy, and he was always saying things. But if you go back and look, he was used as an authority by all the major media when he was working for JSOC. you know, despite the fact he was known to be sort of a hard-on, right-wing sort of guy, like many officers are. And so there we are. You know, you live and die. I don't want to talk about it as treason. I think it was about an inability to get the White House to recognize something that had been reported and reported and reported, which is the moderates don't really exist. This was being reported consistently by all sources inside, and they weren't paying attention to it. So I think at that point, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a call that you know, that makes some sense to me. And the argument that if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is always beholden to the White House, again, he's beholden to the Constitution, is what I'm saying, and that's what he saw. He saw that the White House simply was not paying attention, and Obama, for better or worse, throughout the bureaucracy, the one complaint is you really have a hard time getting stuff to him. And I can tell you...
Well, of course, not too many generals are constitutional lawyers, and so that's really what I was getting at when I asked the question about, I don't know if generals know what the Constitution says or means, but it's certainly not their job to interpret it. But we got to wrap up here, it looks like. Let me ask you, you mentioned in your intro of your book about Obama's legacy, at least on foreign policy. I would say, I guess it kind of starts with the Iran deal, maybe, and, you know, he pledged to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't know, maybe he tried his best. He tried to avoid getting entangled in Syria when Clinton and Kerry were pushing for a, you know, much greater escalation of that fight. On the other hand, you know, he's got this drone program. I mean, where do you come down on his legacy when it comes to foreign policy?
I don't like the fact that he, even in the case of Iran, we just had an article by one of his aides, Ben Rhodes, in the New York Times of last Sunday, in which he was bragging about how they manipulated the press on the Iranian deal. It's wonderful what he did in Iran, but the critical thing wasn't about sanctions and pressures. It was about the fact that after 12 or 13 years of consistently telling the Iranians that we will discuss a nuclear deal with you and enrichment when you stop all enrichment. That was the requirement. You stop. About 2 or 3 years ago, we made it known to Rouhani and others, you can keep on enriching. And that's when the deal got going. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. There's nothing wrong with saying, in the case of the sarin deal, when we still accuse Bashar Assad of doing the sarin, and when the attack took place, they knew, they had intelligence galore, that there were two suspects, El-Nusra potentially, they had sarin and ISIS, and also Bashar Assad's military. They only had one suspect. They didn't tell the American people there was another suspect, and they also didn't tell them that both Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and General Clapper, who was head of the director of Director of National Intelligence, the overriding agency for all intelligence services, had both told the president that they couldn't be sure that they had a case against Bashar. They both said, as Clapper said, it's not a slam dunk, because the sarin that we've seen doesn't match what we know to be in the arsenal. And he doesn't tell the world that. And so I don't like not telling the truth about critical issues. To leave the world thinking Bashar may have done what he may not have done, and I'm not saying I know, I just say that the whole story has not been told by the White House, is like a blood libel to me. And look, you can't get 2 votes for Bashar Assad in the Congress today. I mean, he's hated, and he's a Hitler, and we love our Hitlers. We've had millions of Hitlers, and I'll take a second and say this to you. He's fighting a life and death war with those people. If ISIS or one of those people get in power, he and his wife and their 2 beautiful children are going to be hung up like Mussolini, with their throats cut, in the square. And yes, he uses barrel bombs. But I know a country that, heinous. I know a country that used barrel bombs for 7 years in a war in which their national security was not at stake. It was us. We used barrel bombs full of cacodyllic acid, a defoliate that also has consequences for all sorts of people, as we know now, the number of deformities in Vietnam. We use it with napalm. 7 years we dropped barrel bombs. Why? Because they're cheaper. A barrel bomb oil comes in a barrel bomb is 63 gallons. And it's cheaper than dropping a 500-pounder. So I always wondered when we attacked him for that, first, we did it. I mean, I always wonder about our morality of that. And secondly, is it really better if he'd used a 500-pound bomb, which had maybe 3 times as much lethal stuff than a barrel bomb? I'm not making a case for the guy. He's a despot. He's like, is he any worse than the guys in Saudi Arabia who are chopping off heads right now among the Shiites in eastern Saudi Arabia? Is he any worse than Bahrain? Any worse than UAE, where all sorts of horrible things are happening to the Shiite and minorities? I don't think so. I think he's of a piece. And so there we are. And you ask about the president not getting involved in Syria. He just put 250 special forces troops into Syria. And as far as I know, Bashar Assad's the reigning, still recognized by the UN as the reigning power. And the Russians are there, yes, with approval by the Syrian government. The Iranians are there with approval by the Syrian government. Hezbollah, the Shia group from Lebanon, Nasrallah's group, they're there with approval by the Syrian government. We're not. We're in there not with the approval. Would the president have put 250 special forces guys into Israel without that casually, or to Canada? Hell no. So it's a point of view. The world sees what he does. And I'll tell you something else. If you think the number of American troops into Iraq is 3,000 or 4,000 as they announced, I'm telling you it's 4 or 5 times that amount, and maybe even more if you count the pilots and crew that are doing the bombing from the ocean. And so he's not.
I think we have to.
I'm just saying he's not telling the truth to the people about some basic stuff, and that's bad. On the other hand, let me just say this: I also think he's probably going to be the brightest president we're going to have for the next 50 years.
Well, that is a low bar, but thanks so much for your
department, which is very skilled, did not show up at all, even though the time of the mission, which was supposed to be 20 minutes, ended up being 40 because the SEALs had to fly in a rescue chopper that was also parked in Pakistan, without the Pakistani knowledge. And so it's such a bad story. Let me just tell you a few things. And one of my complaints chronically, when I speak to journalism schools, and I speak actually more in Europe on investigative journalism than here these days, but still, the annual meetings of the IRE, Investigative Reporting Group, I speak to a lot of schools. The first thing I always say is, you have to read before you write. You've got to read. And so one of the things you need to do is take a look at the radar system that Pakistan had. And I'll just take a second to tell you how it began. We know that bin Laden worked for us in the early 80s when we decided, Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski decided we were going to drive the Russians, we were going to have a proxy war with the Russians in Afghanistan. And Schadenfreude, the Russians were stuck as we thought we had been in Vietnam, and we were going to go and we used bin Laden and other fundamentalists to help fight a war and win the war. And we also we began paying a lot of money to the Pakistani intelligence service, which is known as the ISI, and now it's become one of the great tough services of all time. The Pakistani ISI is like the Egyptian military. They have great investments. They own things. They buy property in Australia. They're building a huge... This guy had been out of business for 10 years. This isn't going to end the war, but in the next week or so, the American press, it's what happens when you get a story like this. The White House controlled the narrative. They're begging for briefings. Everybody wants an exclusive. And they're dealing out facts. They had to recant after a little while that he didn't have an AK-47. Then they he had 2 women with weapons protecting him. And then they had to back off that. And there was a firefight, huge firefight, and a lot of people were shot up and killed. They haven't really backed off that, but that sort of diminished. And if you remember, his wives and children were taken away, and we're gonna interrogate them. That never happened. They were flown out by the Pakistani intelligence service a month or so later back to Saudi Arabia. All these stories sort of disintegrated over the next couple of weeks, but nobody paid attention. The press was still, tell us more. And I remember my favorite story was the one about one of the SEALs had brought a dog in on the mission, and they described how the president met the dog, and one of the stories was that when the chopper crashed, they had to blow it up, and big explosion. And if neighbors came in this very sort of elegant area of Pakistan, a resort area, if people came to wonder what's going on, the dog was put outside to tell him, to stay away. And I remember thinking, oh my God, we've got a dog that barks in Urdu, which is the local nature, an Urdu barking dog. So there was no story that wouldn't go. The fire department in this area, which is very skilled, the police.
So let's start by talking about Osama bin Laden, who's plays the title role in your book, which is called The Killing of Osama bin Laden. You challenge virtually every detail of the story, both the official narrative and the media reports. Can you start by summarizing sort of briefly what you found in this piece?
Well, basically, the one reality is the president did authorize the execution, if you will, of Osama bin Laden, and the SEALs did carry it out. And that's a fact, and that's absolutely correct. And it was done in Abbottabad, which was a resort town about 50 or 60 miles uphill from Islamabad, the capital. And it's a place that in the summer, Islamabad, if you've been there in summers, it gets to 120. And so it's I call it the Martha's Vineyard of Islamabad, of Pakistan, where the rich and the generals and the senior bureaucrats go, and they have summer houses. It's sort of an upscale area. That all happened. After that, it's sort of what I describe as a Lewis Carroll story, because the White House said this was all done. He'd gone there. Last time we heard about bin Laden, we were looking for him in the mountains, the Tora Bora area, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush Mountains, sort of a wild man, no man's land. We were looking for him. We couldn't find him. This was late 01, 02. We went on to bomb and attack Iraq and moved away. We're still in this war. When they confronted him, bin Laden, and in order to protect themselves, the SEALs had to shoot him in a room on a compound there. And then we fled out, and we had a chopper that was blew up. It was an accident. It crash landed, and since the Blackhawks, the chopper in which the 2 squads, actually 4 squads of 6, this Navy SEALs, even though they haven't been on water in years, they still move in groups of 6, which that's how many fit into a dinghy. Sort of a nice touch, because the SEALs have gone crazy with the fact that they're not going into the water anymore. And many of them leave because that's just not what they were trained to do, not just run on the ground and kill people. But anyway, the SEALs went in and had to kill him, took the body out and flew back. Meanwhile, a rescue chopper came in, which was a twin-engine chopper. I've forgotten the name of it. It's carries 55 passengers. It travels about 110, maybe 130 miles an hour at most. And they took that out along with the Black Hawk, because they didn't have enough room in the one Black Hawk, and they flew out that way without being detected by the radar. That's the story. And the American press went gung-ho for it. It was a great night when the president announced, "We've got him." That was the words. Basically, he was killed, and the war on terror is over, and the Americans marched in the streets, and I celebrated it too. Was very happy to see him dead, although I knew 15 years now, Bob, and how are we doing in that war? But no, that's another question. And so all of
give it another 15 years.
Oh my God. Yes, there's no end. It seems no end, because we're doing the same policy. My argument basically in the book, in the essays in the book, most of them were written for the London Review books, all of them were, and not that well known here. His argument that Osama bin, that the President of the United States, Barack followed the Cheney-Bush policy much too much more than we really want to know. Anyway, the story is that, the White House story is that, oh my God, we had wonderful couriers. We had people in the basement of the CIA who were tracking couriers, and bin Laden, once he left Tora Bora, why he was active, he was the energetic runner, and he was sending messages and directing traffic for Al-Qaeda, I guess worldwide. That's sort of the implication. They never quite said that. And then the couriers, with amazing skill and with the use of torture, waterboarding. If anybody's seen the movie that was generated out of this, Zero Dark 30, I think it's called. I did see it. It begins with the torture, enhanced interrogation, waterboarding, and we got the evidence we wanted. We got bin Laden, and then we didn't tell the Pakistanis, and we went in by ourselves. 2 choppers could evade the radar of Pakistan, and went in and did the mission, killed the guy, and The guy in the initial story, he had an AK-47.